How's it going, everybody? Too Spooky here, and in this video we're going to be counting down 101 facts about Dead Space. Dead Space is one of my personal favorite games of all time, and with the remake on the horizon, I figured it was finally time to tackle this series with the love it deserves. Therefore, I've scoured all across the galaxy, cracking planets to get as much information as possible about the series at large, which means we'll be covering information from every piece of Dead Space media available, which includes the development and developers of the games, the lore, the characters, the Necromorphs, and so much more. This video will also contain spoilers for Dead Space at large, so proceed with caution and beware of my awful pronunciation. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Number 1. Dead Space began as merely an idea within the brain of Glenn Schofield. Glenn had been working in the gaming industry for over a decade at that point, having plenty of experience being lead artist, art director, game director, and producer for numerous games. Although the vast majority of the games he worked on back then were licensed games, and Glenn was looking to really let out his creative side with something original for a change. Glenn came up with the initial idea for Dead Space around 2005, with only one goal in mind: make the scariest game he possibly could. While Dead Space was heavily inspired by various movies, which we'll touch upon later, Glenn initially pitched Dead Space to EA in 2006, originally under the working title Rancid Moon. It was meant to be a prison escape game in space, but as development progressed, this idea would obviously transform quite a bit, and was reworked to essentially be described as Resident Evil 4 in space. As Resident Evil 4, which came out at the beginning of 2005, would end up becoming one of Glenn's top 5 favorite games of all time, wanting to take what he loved about that game, along with everything he'd learned from creating other games previously to create something handcrafted and special. After creating a prototype on the original Xbox's hardware showcasing what the game and its core mechanics were going to be about, EA gave it the go-ahead and Dead Space officially began its development, with Michael Condrey and Brett Robbins signing on as directors and Glenn as executive producer overseeing the entire process. After a very busy 2 years of production and an initial announcement in 2007, Dead Space would finally release in October of 2008 to Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC. It had a bit of a rocky start with slow sales after a massive marketing budget, but the game would eventually sell over 1 million copies just a year later in 2009. The slow but steady boost in sales would also be in big part to the fact that Dead Space was heavily praised by critics for its seamless gameplay experience, innovation with the lack of HUD, immersive world, terrifying creature design, immaculate sound design, and overall horrifying atmosphere. Additional praise would come in the form of winning numerous gaming awards in 2008 and 2009. Now, 14 years later, Dead Space has cemented its legacy as one of the scariest games ever created, and a true classic for the modern horror genre within gaming. But this would only mark the beginning. Number 2. In addition to the first Dead Space, multiple other Dead Space related media was released around the first game to further promote it, which was done after EA received the Vertical Slice demo showcasing everything the game had to offer during its initial development. EA was so impressed with the potential of the game that they went all out to promote it with other properties. This was known by the developers as IP Cubed. The first multimedia property of this IP Cubed approach would be the Dead Space comic series, which was released monthly in 2008 from March to September. The comic series was written by Anthony Johnston, who would later go on to be a scenario writer for the Dead Space franchise as a whole, and the comic series was illustrated by Ben Templesmith. The comic covers the events that took place on the space colony of Aegis 7, detailing the 5 weeks of horror after the initial discovery of the marker. The story of the comics was written in a way that it can be enjoyed as its own property, but with enough continuity that it ties into the first game as a prequel of sorts. The entire comic has been compiled into a graphic novel that you can purchase, or as an alternative, it was adapted into video format as a motion comic. The other property in IP Cubed was the animated movie Dead Space Downfall. Downfall was written by Justin Gray and Jimmy Palmiotti, directed by Chuck Patton, and developed by Film Roman with supervision from EA. Downfall takes place directly after the events of the comics, illustrating what happened to the crew aboard the USG Ishimura after the Red Marker was transported onto the ship from Aegis 7 before the events of the first game. Similar to the comics, it was meant to be enjoyed as its own property, and Film Roman were given complete creative freedom as long as they did not mess with the lore or the timeline. So with that, Film Roman's goal with Downfall was to make the goriest movie Film Roman ever produced, which is pretty evident with the final product. Downfall was released direct-to-video on October 28th of 2008, a week after the game's initial release. Additionally, a website called No Known Survivors was released as an ARG back in August of 2008, taking you through the lives of 2 employees aboard the Ishimura before, during, and after all hell broke loose in a point-and-click format. Unfortunately, the website URL noknownsurvivors.com was sold within the last few years, and the website is now considered lost media. Number 3. After the release and eventual critical success of the first Dead Space, a couple things happened in the background. Dead Space 2 would officially go into pre-production at the tail end of 2008. However, the creator and director of Dead Space, Glenn Schofield and Michael Condrey, would leave EA to co-found Sledgehammer Games in 2009, therefore having nothing to do with any future installments of the franchise they created. While everything regarding Dead Space 2 was just beginning at this time, EA had another idea for Dead Space in the meantime, that being a different Dead Space title to further push the new IP, which began pre-production in 2008, directly after the first game as well. This would later become Dead Space Extraction, this time helmed by Eurocom Studios. Extraction was essentially a rail shooter exclusively made for the Nintendo Wii's motion control system, taking place before the events of the first game aboard the recently infected Ishimura. Development took about 14 months, which was less than originally anticipated because luckily the studio had a ton of already existing models and assets to use from the first game. Extraction was EA's attempt to see if there was a market for mature games on the Wii, since it was generally perceived as a family-friendly console, which, as it turns out, was kind of true, as Extraction did release to generally positive reviews all around. However, it sold very poorly. Extraction would later be re-released for the PlayStation 3, compatible with their new motion controls in January of 2011 to coincide with the release of Dead Space 2. Extraction also had a comic released to further promote it, made from the same writer and illustrator as the original Dead Space comic, this time focusing on Nicole Brennan. Number 4. Like we said in the previous fact, Dead Space 2 would officially go into production in 2008. During Dead Space 2's development, EA Redwood Shores would become the genre studio Visceral Games, having the entire team split working on both Dead Space 2 and Dante's Inferno. With Glenn and Michael having left the company, Wright Bagwell would take over as director of the project, and many of the previous developers who worked on the first Dead Space also stuck around for Dead Space 2, looking to improve everything they learned from the first game. This time around looking to notably develop Isaac as a character, make his gameplay and the general environment faster paced and more action oriented to attract a larger audience, and further flesh out the horror atmosphere present within the first game. This time around, multiplayer was also included, mainly to appease EA, as they had been pushing for a multiplayer element ever since the first game to reach for a broader audience. After over 2 years of development, Dead Space 2 would officially release worldwide in January of 2011 to Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC. Once again, to critical success. The general consensus was that Dead Space 2 was almost as good, just as good, or even better than the first game for many players. Those who preferred the lean towards a more action-based experience were more likely to prefer Dead Space 2, but so much care was given to the feeling of the first game that returning players would not be disappointed in the slightest. DLC called Dead Space 2 Severed would later be released exclusively to consoles in May of that year, with no explanation on the lack of a PC release. Now with 2 successful games under the Dead Space IP, it's only obvious what was coming next. But before we get to that, we have a few other things to cover. Number 5. After the successful IP Cubed campaign with the marketing of the first Dead Space, EA chose to make Dead Space a Transmedia franchise, and release multiple other Dead Space properties alongside Dead Space 2 to further increase its sales potential. While each property was done by separate entities, Chuck Beaver and Ben Wanat oversaw each property to make sure the continuity of the series was being followed correctly. The first of these multimedia properties was the novel Dead Space Martyr, written by B.K. Evenson and released in July of 2010. Taking place over 2 centuries before the events of the first game, following Michael Altman as he investigates the Black Marker, and how his discovery made Altman the scapegoat to unwillingly found Unitology. Martyr was hailed positively by critics for its unique storytelling and expanding the Dead Space lore in an interesting and thought-provoking manner. The second was Dead Space Ignition, an action puzzle game featuring a choose-your-own-adventure format. The game takes place directly before the events of Dead Space 2, illustrating the initial Necromorph breakout at the Sprawl. The game was developed by Sumo Digital and released in October of 2010 to relatively poor reviews. However, beating the game would heed various unlockables for Dead Space 2, such as a new outfit along with new audio and text logs. The third was Dead Space Salvage, a graphic novel written by Anthony Johnston and illustrated by Christopher Schei. Released in November of 2010, it followed a group of salvagers called the Magpies, who find the wreckage of the Ishimura sometime between the events of Dead Space 1 and 2. Unlike many of the other Dead Space media properties, Salvage wasn't meant to tie directly into the story, and was instead meant to show a different aspect of the Dead Space universe at large, giving Christopher Schei complete creative freedom to really go wild with his illustrations. Salvage was met with fairly positive reviews, however it remains one of the more forgotten Dead Space properties since it didn't tie in with the overarching plot that the rest featured. The fourth was the animated film, Dead Space Aftermath, which was once again produced by Film Roman, who made Downfall back in 2008. Although this time it was directed by Mike Disa, but written by a full team consisting of Brandon Auman, Mike Disa, Chuck Beaver, and Joe Goye. The film takes place after the events of Dead Space 1, this time following the interrogations of survivors from the USG O'Bannon, after they went to check out the Ishimura's initial distress call, arriving 3 weeks later. This film actually featured numerous animation styles for each flashback along with the overarching main plot, each animation being done by a different studio. According to the director, the goal of Aftermath was to create the most disturbing, terrifying movie we can make. It was originally meant to have a release in 2010, but ended up releasing alongside Dead Space 2 in January of 2011, direct to DVD and Blu-ray. The general consensus was that it provided great insight to various plot threads that made seeing it before playing Dead Space 2 a much more enjoyable experience when later tackling the game. The fifth and final was the mobile spin-off game, simply titled Dead Space, also taking place before the events of Dead Space 2 with the initial outbreak at the Sprawl as an all-new story. Developed by Iron Monkey Studios and released on iOS in January of 2011 with Dead Space 2, and then on Android in December of the same year. The game was actually praised for its level of competence as merely a mobile game by critics, even going on to win Best Mobile Game of the Year along with other awards. The only real complaint being some of the controls, but seeing how limited things needed to be for a full Dead Space game to work on mobile in the first place, this was only a small criticism. Otherwise, the game was praised for creating that horrifying environment and competent gameplay experience that Dead Space was known for. Unfortunately, even though it was a great mobile game, especially for its time, it was quietly removed from iOS and Android back in 2016. Number 6. Even though Dead Space 2 was a critical success, and is even hailed as one of the best sequels of any horror game franchise out there, you might be surprised to hear that EA still considered it a complete and total failure. At the very least, commercially speaking. You see, Dead Space 1 was already a bit of a failure in their eyes because it didn't really sell as well as they'd wanted it to. But after seeing all the praise from critics and gamers alike, which eventually led to greater sales, EA saw potential in Dead Space long term to really rake in the money. So with the development of Dead Space 2, they greatly increased the budget for the production, and heavily increased the budget for marketing, which is obvious by all the multimedia properties they released alongside Dead Space 2 alone. But if you were on the internet or watching TV back in 2010 and 2011 when Dead Space 2 was coming out, the marketing for it was literally everywhere, which also included the infamous Your Mom Hates Dead Space 2 ad campaign. I've seen a lot of differing reports for the actual budget. Some have claimed that it wasn't very much more than the first game's budget of $37 million, some have claimed it's $60 million, and others have claimed that it's $60 million for the game's development with another $60 million for marketing alone, reaching a grand total of $120 million. As far as I could deduce with my research, it seems that $60 million is the most agreed upon figure for the full budget. So once the game was finally released, even though it was selling 2 times as many games as the first Dead Space and getting raving reviews, it simply wasn't good enough for EA. And after all was said and done, years later, it was revealed by Ian Milham and Ben Wanat in 2018 that Dead Space 2 ended up selling about as much as the first game overall, but obviously cost significantly more to make. So now, after having a big financial failure and immense pressure to drive future sales from EA, let's talk about the black sheep of the franchise, Dead Space 3. Number 7. Following the critical success of Dead Space 1, it was planned for the series to be a trilogy. However, with the financial failure of Dead Space 2, EA was tempted to pull the plug entirely, and even told the team at Visceral Games that if they didn't find new ways to innovate the series and make it more mainstream accessible, that they were canceling the project. After eventually deciding to continue forward with it, EA also gave the statement that if Dead Space 3 didn't sell 5 million copies, Dead Space would be retired for good. All this led to Dead Space 3 receiving extreme budget cuts, having a much lower budget than the first 2 games. With all that pressure on the line, Ben Wanat would step up as director. He was previously responsible for a lot of the Necromorph design, and co-writing the series' complete lore and continuity, having worked on both of the previous games and many of the side projects. Let's just say Ben had his heart in the right place, wanting to place a heavy emphasis back on horror this time around, and additionally wanting to do things like bring a crafting system into the game that illustrated Isaac's engineering background. But as much as that's what he and the team wanted to do, EA had other plans.
This needs to stop! Now!
Which caused a very troubled production with a lot of clashing between the development team and EA. But since EA is the ultimate overlord, many changes were made and many ideas were scrapped to appease their demands. These demands included throwing the horror elements to the side for more action all across the board, co-op with everyone's favorite character, John Carver, a completely different crafting system than originally intended, and to top it all off, microtransactions.
What do you think?
Whoa, very nice. Look at that.
But that's nothing. Look at this.
That is really nice.
What do you think?
Nice.
Eventually, after quite the struggle development-wise, Dead Space 3 would finally release in February of 2013 to Xbox 360, PC, and PlayStation 3, selling 600,000 copies within its first month, and sales quickly declined after that due to the reviews coming out, meaning that Dead Space 3 would of course be the final game in the franchise as it didn't reach EA's threshold of 5 million sold. The reviews in particular weren't even that bad, but there was a bit of criticism and confusion surrounding the microtransactions, a few plot holes involving the co-op, and of course the major shift to action rather than horror elements, which ultimately took away from many fans' enjoyment. As one last-ditch effort from the development team, once the game was completed but before its official release, a separate team with their own small budget and their own unique ideas created the story DLC, Awakened, which was a small story that focused heavily on the horror elements that Dead Space 3 was missing as a whole. The team stresses that this project was in the works before the game's release, and its shift back to horror had nothing to do with the reviews coming out. So with Isaac's arc now complete, but the story at large left open with the DLC, this would be the end of Dead Space. At least, for a while. Number 8. Similar to Dead Space 1 and 2, Dead Space 3 also had other media released with it to continue the Transmedia approach. However, after extreme budget cuts following Dead Space 2, there was significantly less Dead Space media released compared to the previous game's marketing. The first was the novel, Dead Space Catalyst, which was once again written by B.K. Evenson and is intended to be a sequel to his previous Dead Space novel, Martyr, this time taking place roughly 80 years after the events of Martyr, where EarthGov officials are doing various experiments upon the Black Marker, later following two brothers and their experiences delving into a dark world they couldn't begin to understand. Catalyst was released in October of 2012. The second was a graphic novel, Dead Space Liberation, which was written by Ian Edgington and once again illustrated by Christopher Shy. Liberation began very late into the game's production, with the intention of giving more characterization to John Carver. Ian was given a detailed description of the story at large, the specific aspects he had to mention, and a small time frame to make it happen before the release of Dead Space 3. Christopher Shy was once again given complete creative freedom with the artwork, and worked directly with Ian to make the dialogue and artwork flow well together given their time constraints. Liberation was released alongside Dead Space 3 in February of 2013, and received praise for diving deeper into Carver's character, and overall giving him the much-needed characterization that he was lacking in the game. Finally, the last Transmedia release was The Art of Dead Space, an art book covering art from all the games except for Dead Space 3, which also released alongside Dead Space 3 in February of 2013. Number 9. Dead Space 3 obviously left a bit to be desired, but now that all is said and done, game director Ben Wanat and other development team members have gone on record to talk about what exactly Dead Space 3 was going to be like if EA hadn't intervened so much. The game was already about halfway through development before co-op was even decided upon. Co-op was something that was experimented with all the way back in the first Dead Space's development. And while the team did get co-op to work even back then, it was ultimately cut for budgetary reasons. So now with Dead Space 3, the team at least had a cool way of bringing it into the story, which brings us to the first order of business, Shadow Isaac. Shadow Isaac would have essentially been a hallucination that reflected Isaac's deteriorating mental state, and this second Isaac would be the fill-in for a co-op experience, being able to appear and disappear out of co-op and single player without affecting the narrative or immersion, and would have come heavily into play with the finale, which sounds like a really cool idea on paper. The Shadow Isaac concept was even leaked to the press after Dead Space 3's initial announcement. EA ended up stepping in and demanding the removal of Shadow Isaac as they wanted to avoid themes of psychosis and dementia.
This needs to stop now!
Instead, EA pushed for a no-nonsense soldier-type character because they were a very popular archetype in gaming at the time. This resulted, of course, in John Carver, but his introduction heeded a lot of problems when it came to story presentation and rewrites, even leading to multiple instances in the final game where Carver would just disappear in the middle of scenes he's supposed to be with Isaac because they simply didn't know what to do with him. Ben also wanted to make Carver an awful person, a monster inside and out, as he described. But instead, he was made to be a very tough character who has a sympathetic background once you get to learn more about him. It was always planned for the game to take place on Tau Volantis, but like we mentioned before, Ben wanted it to shift heavily back towards the survival horror elements of the first game, but was forced to take the action route once again to appease EA. So it's sad to say that Dead Space 3 was meant to be quite different in a lot of aspects, and if those changes weren't made, it's quite possible Dead Space 3 would have left more of a lasting impression like the first two games.
Number 10.
Following Dead Space 3, the team responsible for Dead Space over at Visceral Games would be moved over to different projects, and eventually EA would announce that Visceral Games would be closing down in October of 2017, basically shutting the door on any future potential for the series completely. That said, before the studio closed down, the team over at Visceral Games did have a couple plans for Dead Space 4 had they actually got the chance to make it. So here's a look at what Dead Space 4 would have been like. The gameplay and story itself would be something a little bit different, this time expanding upon the flotilla section of Dead Space 3. The game itself would be presented in a non-linear format, and eventually converge at the end to deliver the story at large. So essentially you'd be stuck in this hopeless situation, where you're stranded in space, surrounded by a ton of different lifeless, broken down ships, with the goal of salvaging various pieces of tech from these ships to fix your own. The player could choose which ships to visit, which order to visit them in, and each one would have its own story in regards to figuring out what exactly happened to it, what's happening in the greater part of the universe, dealing with any necromorphs aboard said ships, and ultimately making it out alive with a new piece of hope towards getting your own ship ready. The crafting system present from Dead Space 3 would also receive a complete overhaul to fix the problems that were unintentionally created, and overall rebalance everything. Many new types of necromorphs would have been created to present a greater challenge to the player in zero-gravity environments, such as a necromorph that would weave through zero gravity, knock off the player's helmet, and attempt to eat their face off. As for who the protagonist would be, it was planned to either be an entirely new character following the apocalyptic clean slate presented at the end of Dead Space 3 Awakened, or it would be Ellie, as Ellie was also a contender for Isaac's co-op partner in Dead Space 3, and she was the main contender for taking up the mantle Isaac left behind for Dead Space 4. Additionally, Benoit has also gone on record to say that there was a planned ending for Dead Space 4, but he refuses to speak on what that ending would be, just in case EA ever decided to revive Dead Space and continue the story. Going on to say that while he wouldn't go into the greater details, it would explore the origins of necromorphs even further, and humanity's purpose within the greater part of the universe. Number 11. Now, almost a full 10 years after the franchise's last entry, a remake of the first Dead Space will be releasing on January 27th of 2023, releasing for Xbox Series X and S, PC, and PlayStation 5. The remake was announced to be in development out of the blue in June of 2021. The main reason given for the series' sudden return being the success of EA's single-player game Star Wars Fallen Order, along with the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 coming out. As far as what to expect, the game will be a complete remake of the first game, and everything present within the first game can be expected here, although graphics will obviously be immensely improved, and the new hardware present these days for console and PC give rise to a ton of technical advances to really bring the game to life in new ways, and completely remove any loading screens. As far as additional content that wasn't in the original game, developers have said that this time around, Isaac will have a speaking role instead of being completely silent. This new speaking role for Isaac will additionally come with story developments that will supposedly tie into the lore of Dead Space 2 and 3. The developers have also teased content that was cut from the original game for technical reasons being added this time around, and things such as the zero gravitational system present in Dead Space 2 and 3 being added to make gameplay smoother. The game is being directed by Roman Campos Oriola and Eric Baptizat, and as far as we know, a completely new team at Motive Studio are responsible for bringing it to life. Dead Space is finally back with a fresh new set of eyes. In due time, we'll have to see if this ends up being a good thing, or if Dead Space will once again fall silent. Number 12. Remember earlier how Dead Space was originally under the working title, Rancid Moon, and was meant to be a prison escape game in space? Well, do I got news for you. It's a little something called the Callisto Protocol. When creating the original Dead Space, the prison escape concept was dropped pretty early on because the team loved the idea of being in space, but didn't resonate with the prison escape aspect. Considering prison escape in space was Glenn's original idea, let's just say he's held on to that idea ever since, and seeing its potential, he decided to finally bring it to life. As the Callisto Protocol takes place on a prison colony on Jupiter's moon, Callisto, as some sort of alien invasion begins to occur, possibly from within. This game came about because Glenn founded Striking Distance Studios in 2019 within PUBG Studios, as PUBG was looking to expand their universe with new ideas. And having the space prison escape aspect in the back of his mind for so long, Glenn presented it to PUBG thinking it would fit well in their universe. And they agreed, so with Glenn back on as director, he got to work. But after a while, it became clear that the Callisto Protocol was going to be something else entirely, and completely unrelated to PUBG. The Callisto Protocol does share some similarities to Dead Space, such as no HUD, a kinesis-like ability, being a horror survival experience, and so on. But this is obviously just because these are the type of games Glenn truly likes to make and reflects his personal style. The game released on December 2nd of 2022 for PC, PlayStation 4 and 5, and Xbox One and Series X/S. Even if you're looking forward to the Dead Space remake coming out, I highly recommend you check out the Callisto Protocol as well. Glenn and his team created something truly special with the first Dead Space, and I have no doubt they're about to do it again with this one. About that, Yeah, so the reviews are a little bit mixed on the Callisto Protocol. Some people think it's great, other people think it's garbage. I plan on playing it myself, along with the Dead Space remake over on my Twitch, twitch.tv/2spookster, so we'll see if it's good or not. It definitely had quite the harsh release day. But yeah, definitely take this as a little self-plug for my Twitch, twitch.tv/2spookster. I would love to meet more of you guys, and hanging out while we play some of these games would be a great time to do it, so I hope to see you there. Number 13. When it comes to the conception of Isaac Clarke, Glenn wanted him to be relatable, in the sense that he was just a normal guy doing his job, being thrust into this horrible situation. As your everyday engineer, he was never suited for combat. This was also what inspired Glenn to make Isaac a silent protagonist, basing it off of Gordon Freeman from Half-Life 2. Glenn wanted Isaac to almost be a self-insert for the player to experience these horrors in his shoes, but at the same time didn't want his silence to come across as just some scaredy cat always taking orders. While Isaac's suit was a standard engineering rig created specifically to help him lift very heavy objects, it wasn't meant to withstand an alien infestation. Even the weapons he used were various mining tools that Isaac would be familiar with, and using these tools as weapons was meant to illustrate his engineering background, as he had to think of new ways to use them for carnage. Isaac would evolve from a silent protagonist in Dead Space 2, as the developers felt that with everything he experienced, he would have some things to say this time around, and use his newfound voice to really explore his mental health and his character. It was definitely a creative risk to do so after having him be silent the entire first game, but adding his voice was necessary for the future of the series. Isaac would then be portrayed and modeled after Gunnar Wright going forward. Like we mentioned before, in the new remake, Isaac will be speaking this time around. However, it's been stated that his dialogue will only be inserted where it's absolutely necessary, especially in instances where it was, frankly, quite weird for him to remain silent in the original. Number 14. Isaac's name was based on science fiction writers Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, as Glenn was a big fan of both of their work, but was much more influenced by the works and philosophies of Clarke. Additionally, the names of Isaac's parents were also based on science fiction writers, Octavia Clarke and Paul Clarke being based on Octavia Butler and Paul Anderson. Number 15. The majority of the original Necromorphs were of course primarily designed by Ben Wanat. The general idea was to somehow design various archetypes on the idea of some otherworldly infection forcing the human body to evolve. Except the body itself doesn't have the means to reach that evolution, which forces it to twist, contort, and ravage itself until it reaches something that is close enough with the body mass it already possesses. With that notion in mind, the goal was to make the majority of the Necromorphs retain some aspect of their former humanity. That way the player almost feels bad for dismembering them because they were once human too. Because of the horrific concept behind the Necromorphs, Ben and his team had to do a lot of extracurricular research about human anatomy, specifically how various parts of the body could be rearranged into something terrifying and grotesque. To accomplish this, the team researched a lot of actual photos from medical surgeries, autopsies, and accidents, which they kept in a folder labeled Body Trauma. This research in particular is what shifted many of the early Necromorph designs from something purely alien to something that appeared more human, because in their opinion, the more they look like normal people who went through something terrible, the deeper the emotional impact. This research on disfigured bodies also inspired the look of many of the dead bodies you come across aboard the Ishimura. When it came to the name Necromorph, this term was helmed by Ben's wife, as apparently she was just flipping through the various designs, and came up with it on the spot because they looked like transformed corpses, as necro meaning death, and morph meaning to change. Everyone at the studio loved the name, but decided to use it within the universe itself as little as possible, because they thought saying Necromorph out loud sounded a bit silly when they were attempting to give the game such a serious tone. That said, in-universe, the term was first used by Terrence Kyne. Number 16. When it came to the dismemberment mechanic, Glenn's main inspiration for it came from the movie Inside, along with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He described that the crazy nurse from the movie Inside kept having these horrific and painful things happen to her, but each time she just kept getting back up, even if it seemed impossible. And in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface would just keep coming through the woods no matter what. Since most video games at the time would incentivize headshots to any of their enemies to take them down quickly, Glenn wanted to go the opposite route, where if you shot the enemy enemy in the head, it would cause them to charge you, for instance, forcing you to cut off their limbs to put them down for good. But even after taking out a limb or two, the enemy would still find a way to get back up and come after you, just like the movies that inspired them. Number 17. Speaking of movies, various horror movies were without a doubt the biggest inspiration for Dead Space. Glenn found inspiration from video games like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and System Shock, for instance, but he looked to horror movies to try and create the scariest game he could, notably looking for the scariest ideas while learning about the importance of sound and timing to get the jump scares just right. Glenn went on record to say he watched upwards of 300 different horror, science fiction, and horror science fiction movies to prepare for the game. The biggest inspirations were the Alien trilogy, The Thing, and Event Horizon. As the concept of an alien being brought onto the ship from a strange planet to slowly kill off the crew was taken from Alien, the horrific body transformations of the Necromorphs being taken from The Thing, and the concept of a spaceship going straight to hell was taken from Event Horizon. But while those were the biggest inspirations, Dead Space was also inspired by movies like Inside, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Martyrs, Audition, Sunshine, Solaris, Escape from New York, The Shining, High Tension, A Tale of Two Sisters, Eden Log, and Desperation. But to be fair, these are only the movies that have been directly mentioned as inspirations in various interviews. After Dead Space completed its development, but before the game's actual release, a giveaway was held where the development team gave away 100 sci-fi and horror movie DVDs that were used in the development of Dead Space, as these 100 films specifically helped inspire Dead Space in one way or another. It would take me a bit too long to list all 100 of these by name, but the list is on screen if you want to see 100 movies that directly inspired the game. Number 18. Speaking of movies that inspired the games, and speaking about The Thing for that matter, we've gotta mention John Carpenter, as during an interview with Game Informer, he expressed how he'd love to direct a feature film for Dead Space, going on to say, Dead Space would just make a great movie, because you have these people coming onto an abandoned, shut down spaceship, and they have to start it up and something's on board. It's just great stuff. I would love to make Dead Space into a film. I'll tell you right now, that one is ready-made. After that interview came out, Dead Space creator Glenn Schofield would end up meeting with John Carpenter a few weeks later, thanking him for his inspirations to make the game happen in the first place, and also expressing that he hopes the two can one day work together. Around the time of Dead Space 2's development, EA themselves even expressed their own interest in making a Dead Space film franchise happen. Although due to poor sales of Dead Space 3, all further Dead Space properties and plans were halted indefinitely, and the potential Dead Space film obviously never ended up happening. Maybe with the remake now coming out, this could potentially still happen one day. Number 19. In Dead Space 3, Tau Volantis was also directly based on the Arctic environment present in the movie The Thing, to illustrate the feeling of isolation and paranoia present within that movie. Number 20. Gunnar Wright did play Isaac in live action for a brief moment in the Dead Space 3 launch trailer. Additionally, there does exist a short live action fan trailer, created by user Eric Zaragoza and his team. For a low-budget fan adaptation, I have to say it's pretty cool. There will be a link in the description if you want to check it out. Number 21. Over the course of the series, there were quite a few Necromorph concepts that never came to be. The ones we know about are as follows. The first and most infamous would be the Flyer, which was intended to be in both the first and second game. In the first game in particular, the Flyer was added very early on, but during testing, they realized it wasn't a very fun enemy to fight and ran into some technical difficulties as well, ultimately deciding to remove it, and repurpose the flight aspect to the Infector to some degree. However, the Flyer would make an appearance in Dead Space Extraction. The second were known as Grabbers. While Grabbers were featured in Dead Space Extraction and the movie Dead Space Aftermath, they were originally going to be featured in the first Dead Space as well, but were cut for technical difficulties. That said, from a lore standpoint, it's likely that the Grabbers were still technically present on the Ishimura during the first game, as Grabbers are considered more of an aquatic necromorph that would have been present in the ship's sewer system, which Isaac never ended up going to. Additionally, an early slasher concept known as the Grabber Slasher was also cut from the game, but would have obviously been a mixture of a grabber and slasher, whose goal would be to grab the player from afar with the long arm in its chest, bring the player closer, and slash at them with the other arm. The third was known as the Swinger. The Swinger also would have been present in the first game, consisting of an upper torso and a tail of 2 tentacles. The tail would have swung the Swinger from ceiling to ceiling and spit acid at the player. Once it was shot off the ceiling, it was also meant to hit the ground and split into 2 pieces that would both charge the player. The fourth was dubbed Commander. Commander was meant to be a mini-boss in the first game, similar to the Brute, but was cut pretty early on for unknown reasons. The fifth was dubbed the Bully, which was a regenerative type necromorph that would have been present in Dead Space 2. However, it was cut and replaced with the Ubermorph. Then, the sixth and final cut necromorph that we know about was called the Flytrap, which was meant to be an environmental enemy in Dead Space 2. Basically, it would have been similar to a premature guardian, being a full human body stuck to various parts of the wall with its innards hanging down. If the player got too close, it would grapple them. Number 22. Like we mentioned, Isaac was just a normal engineer with no combat experience thrust into this impossible survival situation. And all the weapons he uses aside from the pulse rifle are just various mining and engineering tools that he came across throughout his quest for survival. In universe, each of these tools were as follows. The Plasma Cutter was a tool designed to use ionized gas and plasma energy to chip pieces off of boulders so they'll easily fit into smelting tubes. The IM-822 handheld ore cutter line gun was a tool that used thermal energy to cut rock and ore that the Plasma Cutter couldn't get through. The RCDS remote-controlled disc ripper was used to shoot diamond-coated blades at 17,000 RPM to cut through any rocks in front of it, usually as a last resort to cut through extremely tough rock, since the tool itself is rather dangerous. The PMF-100 is just a large blowtorch. The C-99 Super Collider Contact Beam utilizes kinetic energy as a miniaturized particle accelerator, used mostly to quickly obliterate large rocks or meteors to extract the ore inside without damaging it. It was also noted to be awful for digging, but extremely useful at clearing piles of rubble. The handheld gravitation accelerator, or force gun, is a short-range kinetic booster, used primarily for terraforming by having a blasting power greater than conventional explosives. The kinesis module was used to carry objects of all sizes via an artificial gravity field. And finally, the stasis module was used for many different applications, working with advanced quantum physics that aren't really explained within the game. It was used to slow dangerous equipment in the mining field so that said equipment could be repaired. In a medical sense, it was used to slow individuals for surgical purposes, and was also used by security, law enforcement, and military personnel to slow and apprehend criminals. Number 23. During development of the first game, Isaac wasn't able to run, and the developers never wanted him to be able to. However, one of the biggest complaints during playtesting was that Isaac should be able to run past certain enemies. One, because he'd be f***ing terrified, but the other reason being so he can reposition himself, as it was quite difficult to take on a ton of enemies at once after they kind of cornered you in certain hallways. The reason developers didn't want him to run was because they didn't want players to just run past everything without consequences and beat the game too fast. So to counteract this, they had to come up with a new plan, which ultimately ended up being adding more enemies in certain locations and coming up with the quarantine lockdown for certain rooms that would only lift once all the enemies in the area were dealt with, forcing the player to slow down and fight because otherwise it was literally impossible to progress through the game. Additionally, once Isaac was finally able to run, to get the effect of Isaac running through zero gravity areas, the mocap actor tied bungee cords to his ankles and took heavy steps to achieve that effect. Number 24. One of the most important elements of Dead Space's development was the sound design, which was so revolutionary that it ended up winning the game numerous awards. The sound design was done by Don Veka, and his team consisting of Dave Swenson, Andrew Lackey, and Dave Feza. Glenn's research with horror movies gave him a newfound appreciation for the use of sound, as he would have his crew watch certain scenes without sound, and then with sound, just to illustrate how important it was going to be for making this game truly scary, and spent a lot of time with the sound team making sure the timing for scares was just right to achieve that terror. Two of the most notable moments for quality sound design was the use of the screeching sound from the Bay Area Rapid Transit train tunnels, forcing players to run through a room to get away from that horrible sound, along with the muffling of all sound effects once Isaac enters a vacuum. But if you really pay attention, the whispers, the sound cues, everything about the sound design in Dead Space is just perfect. Number 25. Another important aspect of the Dead Space series as a whole was the music, almost all of which was composed by Jason Graves. Jason joined pretty early on during development of the first game, as the team were looking for music inspired by Christopher Young, which Jason was already heavily inspired by, additionally looking at the music of The Shining for his inspiration in Dead Space's score. His goal was to use modern contemporary instruments to make the score as non-musical and eerie as possible, using a live orchestra to get the desired sounds. To this day, Graves considers it his most challenging, yet most enjoyable composing experience, as he had pretty much complete freedom from the sound team. Jason would come back again for Dead Space 2 with the goal of making a new and improved version of his original score, this time looking to Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima as a huge inspiration for his use of strings, also citing the work of Bela Bartok and Igor Stravinsky as inspirations, and his reason for playing against genre expectations with his work. When it came to Dead Space 3, Jason would take the helm once again. However, this time around he was also joined by James Hannigan at the request of EA, as each of them would take on different aspects of the soundtrack. Jason wanted to keep the roots of his work from the earlier games with the sequel as well. However, with the shift away from horror and towards action elements instead, Jason had to add some modern, edgier appointments, as he called it. And while Jason was hard at work with that, James was in charge of the music involved with moving the narrative forward, noting the music of John Williams as his inspiration. While the scores of both artists would sometimes overlap within certain sequences, the two of them pretty much avoided each other's work. Jason would be nominated for and win various awards regarding his music for the first two games. However, critics noted the step down with the soundtrack of the third game, and how the music of Jason and James didn't mesh very well together or side by side, making it a rather confusing experience. Number 26. There's been a long-standing rumor that Dead Space was originally going to be System Shock 3. The thing is, this is both true and untrue at the same time. The truth of the matter is that before Dead Space was given the green light, the team over at EA Redwood Shores was eager to work on a horror game in general. Glenn was busy attempting to sell EA on his original IP, which would later become Dead Space, but because EA was very hesitant at putting any faith in a new property, it was taking some time to actually convince them. In the meantime, since EA had much more faith in existing properties, and they of course owned the rights to System Shock, the team was considering taking on the daunting task of System Shock 3, and each member of the team was incentivized to go replay System Shock 2 so they could try and think of ideas for the third one. However, during this initial planning phase for a new System Shock, Resident Evil 4 would drop, which would change everything. As everyone on the team was so impressed with Resident Evil 4's gameplay and greatly wanted to improve on the mechanics in that game with something new of their own, this was the final push Glenn needed to get his prototype moving, and any plans for a new System Shock were completely dropped. So while it's true that the team at EA Redwood Shores were planning on making a System Shock 3, Dead Space itself was never meant to be System Shock 3, nor was it attached to System Shock 3 in any way. Although Dead Space would still obviously be influenced by some elements of System Shock 2, which is predominantly where this rumor comes from. Additionally, after a very troubled development, it looks like System Shock 3 is finally coming out in March of 2023, so long as no more delays or cancellations happen in the meantime. Number 27. The creation of Unitology was helmed by Glenn about 5 months into development. He felt there was some element of uneasiness that was missing in the game, and after some thought on that missing feeling, he realized the game was missing a religion. After researching the Chicxulub crater for an unrelated reason, he came up with the concept of Unitology. The basic idea being that millions of years ago, a meteor struck Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, which eventually led to humanity. But what if that meteor was sent here on purpose by someone or something to purposely create us? This would make the discovery of the marker a force that even the most skeptical scientist would question, leading to faith, which would lead to fanatics, and overall painting a horrifying analogy of a religion going crazy with irrational thought at the presence of something unknown. While Glenn came up with the idea, Ben Wanat and Chuck Beaver handled a lot of the religious lore as it was needed for the plot. Number 28. While Unitology is obviously a very important part of the Dead Space story, it also garnered a great deal of criticism, specifically from the Church of Scientology, as Unitology is almost seen as a large parody of Scientology, its practices, and even how the inner workings of the religion operate. This comparison has been repeatedly shot down by most developers involved. For instance, Wright Bagwell has gone on record to say, "For us, Unitology's purpose in the story represents people's illogical thinking about things they don't understand. It was never really intended to be a jab at any particular religion. It was really just an observation about what can happen to anybody who is fanatical and illogical about their beliefs." Some members of the Dead Space development team have also gone on record to say that Unitology was directly based on Scientology, so it's been a point of contention for a long time. Number 29. An entire original written language was conceived for the first game in the form of the marker symbols. These symbols can be found spread all throughout the Ishimura, the Sprawl, and places like the main menus to reveal hidden messages. There are numerous transcripts present in the games to decipher these symbols, but the most prevalent example early on is found within Chapter 6 of the first game. Number 30. In addition to the last fact, when it came to Dead Space 3, a unique spoken language was created for the alien civilization formerly present on Volantis, which was apparently quite the challenge for the audio team, having to come up with the phonemes and pronunciation. Number 31. Within the first game, the drag tentacle was easily the biggest challenge the development team had to overcome, simply because it took them months to get it right. The first few weeks of trying were met with only failure all around, and it ended up taking an entire dedicated strike team over a month after that to get everything to work. This was namely because so much was involved with that single scene, as there needed to be completely new animations for Isaac and the tentacle itself, along with an entirely new shooting mechanic, which led to entirely new shooting animations for each gun, physics for where the player was in conjunction with the tentacle grabbing you, and just so much more. The tentacle was only meant to appear in one scene, but because it cost so much money, time, and effort to get that small sequence just right, they ended up cutting a few other scenes in the game and reused it 2 more times. In interviews, Glenn is adamant about refusing to elaborate on what those cut sequences would have been. Before the release of Dead Space 2, a competition was held called Get Dismembered in Dead Space 2, where players were asked to submit their ideas for unique ways Isaac could dismember a necromorph. The team at Visceral would then take their 10 favorites for fans to vote on, and the winner would not only have their idea put into the game, but the winner would also have their likeness inserted into the game as well. The winner ended up being Daniel Emerson with his idea, dubbed the Meat Cello. This move was meant to kill leapers by stomping its head and ripping off its tail all at once. But due to balancing issues, the final product just involved Isaac stomping its head before throwing the leaper over his shoulder so it could still attack. Daniel, on the other hand, made it into the game as an NPC that gets killed in Chapter 2. Number 33. When it came to the marketing of the first Dead Space, the community manager at EA, Ben Swanson, went on record to say that Dead Space was banned in Germany, China, and Japan before its release. However, as it turns out, that was never true, and the first Dead Space was never banned anywhere, making this merely a marketing ploy to give Dead Space some infamy before its release. Number 34. When it came to the development of the USG Ishimura, the goal was to step far away from the traditional overpolished look of science fiction, thinking it looked impractical, and by making the Ishimura feel like it was lived in, it was intended to make the player feel more terror as everything gets worse as you progress. To achieve this vision of future aesthetics and practicality, the Ishimura was designed with Gothic architecture in mind, while the lighting was based on the strong lights you find at the dentist's office. Ultimately, the developers were quite successful in making the Ishimura feel like a character in itself as you transverse through, and one of the most recognizable ships in modern science fiction. With the upcoming remake, it's been mentioned by developers that this time around you're able to backtrack as much as you want through the ship, or move around freely instead of a semi-linear pattern like the original, although you still have to be careful doing so, because backtracking could involve some new dangerous encounters in itself. Number 35. In-universe, the USG Ishimura is named after astrophysicist Hideki Ishimura, as he was responsible for creating the shock point drive that allowed humanity to travel beyond light speed. Hideki was also a side character in the novel Dead Space Martyr, and was present with the study of the Black Marker. It's assumed he created the shock point drive at some point after this, but in the story he was one of the first witnesses of the Black Marker turning someone into a necromorph, so it's kind of surprising he was left alive after the incident. Number 36. In the autopsy report log featured in Chapter 2 of the first Dead Space, it was mentioned that Captain Benjamin Mathias's leukocyte count was very low, with eosinophils in particular almost non-existent. Basically meaning his white blood cell count was extremely low, with the ones capable of fighting infections non-existent. While never really explored again, it's insinuated that this is basically the explanation for how the markers transform people into necromorphs, by literally using some sort of method to attack the body's white blood cells, allowing for the infection to take effect. Number 37. In addition to the last fact, it's also been revealed through text logs that if a marker is destroyed, any necromorphs that were created by it will literally fall apart and turn into some sort of organic sludge. This was referenced with the destruction of marker 3A, along with the shard that was destroyed aboard the O'Bannon, meaning that the markers are not only responsible for turning people into necromorphs, but they are additionally responsible for keeping them alive after the fact. The only unknown aspect at this time is whether or not the markers directly control the actions of each necromorph once they are created. Number 38. Within the first Dead Space, the various whispers Isaac hears in the background from the marker's influence are as follows. You must put back. Bring us the marker. The empty need new purpose. Help give purpose to the empty. Death is the beginning. He's the one. He's the one. Don't leave me here. Bring us the church. And finally, do you love me? Additionally, in Chapter 11, the marker symbols present on the screens translate to the following messages. The unity future of mankind is a place, a physical journey that must be taken, a pilgrimage reserved for only the privileged ones when the time comes. Unity is forever, death is only the beginning. Keep us whole. Do not fear death, for it is the ultimate journey, a necessary step to new life. And fear not, it's just death. And finally, if you get too close to the marker, you can hear a chanting of sorts. The chanted phrase is Latin, and when translated, it says, "We are here in death. It is our saint." Number 39. The Fodder Necromorph from Dead Space 3 was based on an early necromorph concept from Dead Space 1. The early concept involved a squid-like alien resting inside a corpse and controlling its movements. Once you tried to dismember the corpse, the necromorph would basically reveal itself by trying to reattach the severed limb, giving the player an opportunity to kill the necromorph since it's now exposing itself. If the player failed to do so, the necromorph would reattach the limb, retreat back into the body, and you'd have to try dismembering it all over again. While the full concept wasn't completely brought over, the fodder later became this earlier concept by having a necromorph simply get inside and control a mummified corpse. Number 40. Within the medical deck of the Ishimura, there exists the Biological Prosthetic Center, which is basically a laboratory room filled to the brim with babies in containers of green liquid. The purpose of this area is basically to grow clones of the crew with no higher brain function, so they can be rapidly grown and harvested for limbs or organs, because apparently it is common enough aboard the Ishimura to suffer injuries that require amputation or surgery on the regular. And they just have these meat sacks at the ready to harvest limbs to give to patients as biologically compatible prosthetics. Very, very dark when you really think about it. Additionally, this is likely where the lurkers originated from, since they are created from infant bodies, and these are the only known infants present on the ship. Though it is also possible that some individuals aboard the ship gave birth during their stay. Number 41. In Chapter 5 of Dead Space 2, if you get killed by the Tormentor while hanging out in space, you get a little homage to the cover art of Dead Space 1, with Isaac's hand floating by.
Number 42.
In the first Dead Space, a game log mentioned that Michael Altman, the unintentional founder of Unitology, was an anthropologist. but this was later changed to a geophysicist in the novel Dead Space Martyr, and this change was later reiterated in Dead Space 2. Number 43. Victor Barlett's security armor has the name K. Wilson on the breastplate. This either means that Victor originally had a different name that the developers forgot to change on the armor, or that Victor stole this armor from someone else. Number 44. It's widely speculated that the Hunter Necromorph is actually Brant Harris from the comic series, as audio logs with Dr. Mercer mention using a patient from the colonies to further his Necromorph experiments. Brant was sent to the Ishimura after accidentally killing a nurse, where he was later observed by Nicole Brennan and put into captivity. From another audio log, we know that he also must have escaped and killed Eileen Fisk. But considering Brant was the only known patient from the colonies aboard the Ishimura at the time, it's likely that he became Dr. Mercer's guinea pig, later becoming the Hunter. Number 45. On Titan Station, there are multiple advertisements for the EAF toy line, which stands for Extinct Animal Friends. According to this, penguins, wolves, eagles, giraffes, elephants, bears, chimpanzees, dolphins, hippos, and bees are all extinct on Earth. Though with the current state of Earth in this universe, it's likely the list is much larger than that. Number 46. When it comes to Tau Volantis, the research done by the SCAF stated that the frozen temperatures of Tau Volantis are almost as cold as those found in space itself. For those who don't know, the temperatures of space are around -270 Celsius or -455 Fahrenheit, meaning that even if they are slightly exaggerating those temperatures, we can assume the temperatures of Tau Volantis are at least around -200 degrees Celsius or -320 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still cold enough for anyone to almost immediately freeze to death. Yet, multiple characters in Dead Space 3 either take off their helmets or just don't wear one at all in this hellish climate, meaning those numbers have to be completely wrong, or this was merely an oversight by the developers. Number 47. Executive producer Steve Papotzis confirmed that Nathan McNeil is the one who transforms into a necromorph during the post-credit scene of Dead Space Extraction, and is promptly killed by Lexine in self-defense. This is why Nathan is never mentioned in Dead Space 2 Severed, even though he also seemingly escaped at the end of Extraction. Number 48. The intermediate engineering rig features a forearm guard on the right hand. Within universe, this forearm guard is present on whichever arm is dominant for the individual. Isaac just happens to be right-handed. Number 49. At the end of the trailer for the new Dead Space remake, there's a red light flickering aboard the Ishimura. This is Morse code that reads, "Make us whole." Number 50. John Carver's name wasn't always John Carver. Instead, his name was going to be John Cooper, as he was initially called Coop, as in co-op, which later became Cooper. It wasn't until the last 9 months of production or so that his name was changed to Carver. And even then, Carver is a reference to the dismemberment aspect of the games, as in, he's carving up necromorphs. Number 51. During the first chapter of Dead Space 2, you can see various instances of the Visceral Games logo on X-ray charts, and when it comes to the charts of various test subjects, the photos on them are the actual faces of the UI development team. Additionally, in Chapter 3, a visual hair ad for a hair salon has the face of executive producer Steve Papotzis. Number 52. While all of the necromorphs present in the first Dead Space were derived from people, there was originally a plan to have a necromorph derived from an animal as well. Apparently, aboard the Ishimura, it would have been quite common for workers to bring aboard hairless cats for their long trips in space, namely because they were very affectionate animals and didn't have any hair to clog the vents. This would have become a necromorph known as the Corrupted Cat. They would have been a much smaller necromorph like the Lurker, traveled in packs, and would have jumped the player before scratching the hell out of them. While the idea of necromorph animals obviously wasn't included, there did end up being a dog variant of a Lurker in Dead Space 3. Number 53. In the beginning of Dead Space 2, when you reach the first store, there's a scale nearby that lists Isaac's weight as 195 pounds, and if you purchase the CEC engineering suit, it raises his weight to 255 pounds.
Number 54.
While physical cheat codes are a bit of a relic for games these days in the age of microtransactions, Dead Space 1 actually had multiple cheat codes. Using the Xbox 360 controller, the codes are as follows. XXYYY refills your oxygen, XYYXY refills your stasis. YXYXXYXXYXXY gives you 5 extra power nodes. XXXYX gives you 1000 credits. YXXXY gives you 2 power nodes. XXXYY gives you 2000 credits. XXXYXY gives you 5000 credits. And XYYYXXY gives you 10,000 credits. Each of these codes can only be used once, aside from refilling oxygen and stasis, which can be used indefinitely. Number 55. In Dead Space 2, for whatever reason, when you kill an enhanced slasher during the chase with the Ubermorph, you can hear them yelling "No" before they die. This never happens in any other instance, and it's unknown if this was done to illustrate Necromorphs retaining some sort of their humanity, or as merely some developer mistake with the sound. Number 56. In the early stages of development, when trying to figure out how to display Isaac's health on his person without the need of a HUD, someone mentioned seeing some sort of HUD on scuba gear, which gave them the idea of putting the health meter on Isaac's back. The funny part is that Glenn has no clue who mentioned this to him in the first place, and through all his research, he could never find any example of the aforementioned scuba gear that this was apparently based on. Number 57. In addition to the previous fact, Isaac's suit was originally designed by artist Chi-Wai Lau. In an interview, Chi explained that Isaac's suit went through many different iterations before the final design. Some were very slim-fitted, others much bulkier, and some even carried a futuristic sword. Before the team came up with the concept of having the health rig on the spine, many of Chi's early designs already had a prominent life support system equipped to the spine. Chi's inspiration for this came from the various Eva units in Neon Genesis Evangelion, and with the visual health aid presented from the team, both concepts would be combined into the final design. And with the idea of making the general architecture and aesthetic of Dead Space much more gothic, Chi used this concept to experiment with the ribbing present on Isaac's suit, even though he personally found it to be quite boring. All of this would later accumulate into the iconic look that Isaac, and Dead Space for that matter, would become known for. Number 58. In the opening sequence of Dead Space 2, the man who is violently transformed into a necromorph is directly based on producer Rich Briggs, who is a producer for both Dead Space 1 and 2. Apparently, he had the perfect shaped face for the kill sequence, and when asked if they could use his likeness, he just couldn't say no. Number 59. In the E3 debut trailer for the original Dead Space, Nicole was featured with longer brown hair, instead of the shorter blonde look that she would have later on. Number 60. Each game has the elusive Peng treasure, which is basically a little trophy that you can find that is shaped like a woman, which gives you an achievement and is the most expensive item you can sell at the store. While its purpose is never really explained within the universe, there are multiple advertisements featuring Peng throughout the Ishimura and the Sprawl. These posters usually feature a woman with various phrases like, "Get ya some," "Relax," "Just for you," "Delicious," "I love my Peng," "I want more Peng," etc., etc., which leads to the popular fan theory that Peng is some sort of adult escort service. To further prove this theory, there is some graffiti in the first game that says, "I give great Peng." Number 61. Since Dead Space Mobile unfortunately isn't around anymore, it doesn't really matter if I spoil that the main character Vandal is revealed at the end of the game to be a woman named Carrie Norton, making her the only female protagonist in any third-person Dead Space game. It's also interesting to note that her rig number was 438642, and in Dead Space 2 you can find 2 audio logs from Carrie, as they mention being from her rig number. The sad thing is that the second log mentions that this was her final log, meaning she's likely dead after the events of Dead Space Mobile. Number 62. Apparently, the creative director for Dead Space 3 wrote an entire 10,000-word story for every spaceship and their personnel for the flotilla section of the game. That way, if you go up and investigate each ship, each one has its own individual story to tell. Like we mentioned earlier, this concept would have been greatly expanded upon for Dead Space 4 had the game ever been made. Number 63. Every clock present in Dead Space 2 is stuck at 12 o'clock. This is likely a reference to the fact that the Site 12 marker is at the Sprawl. Number 64. The Unitologist cult members, known as the Scrapers, share the same name and a very similar appearance to the Scraper from Silent Hill 3. Obviously, Silent Hill was one of the inspirations for Dead Space, but it's unknown if this Scraper is a direct nod to that series or merely a coincidence. Number 65. If you've played the games in any capacity, you've likely accidentally decapitated yourself getting too close to a Guardian Necromorph. A fun fact about this would be that even if you use stasis to slow down a Guardian, its tentacle will still travel at a normal speed and game end you if you get too close. Number 66. In between the development of Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2, Visceral Games also worked on the game Dante's Inferno. In Europe and Australia, a special limited edition of Dante's Inferno was released called Death Edition, which featured a wide variety of bonus content, which also included a code for a new skin for Dante, that new skin being Isaac Clarke. So while it was just a cosmetic skin, you could also take Isaac out of the hell that is Dead Space and send him to literal hell instead. Additionally, in North America, a special limited edition of Dante's Inferno was released called Divine Edition, which featured pretty much all of the same bonus content from the Death Edition, except there was no code for Isaac, meaning only individuals from Europe and Australia were able to send Isaac to hell. Number 67. In addition to the last fact, Isaac has also been featured as a playable character or an unlockable skin in various other games. These include Dragon Age 2, My Sims Agents, Tiger Woods PGA Tour 10, Skate 3, Army of 2, The 40th Day, Army of 2, The Devil's Cartel, NBA Jam On Fire Edition, and PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Also, as a last-minute addition, it has recently been leaked that Isaac is going to be dropping into Fortnite as well. Number 68. A lot of aspects from the original Xbox prototype made it into the final game without being changed at all in pre- or post-production, those being the general gameplay mechanics like the dismemberment, the lack of HUD, and the zero-gravity jumping, but entire level prototypes like the asteroid and the engine room also made it into the final game. Additionally, the original prototype was created using a modified version of the same engine used to make Tiger Woods PGA Tour games, which explains why Isaac was featured in Tiger Woods PGA Tour 10. Number 69. The hardest challenge of Dead Space 2 is Hardcore Mode, which not only bumps up the Necromorph's power and durability tenfold, but only gives the player 3 saves throughout the entire playthrough, meaning if you forgot to save and die, you have to start all over. And only having 3 saves total means you really have to plan out your entire run to utilize those saves effectively. Sounds pretty difficult, and let me tell you, it is. But after completing such a hard challenge, you are rewarded with something pretty unique, that being the hand cannon, which is basically a foam finger that one-shots any enemy you come across in your next playthrough, equipped with Isaac making bang bang and pew pew sounds. While the hand cannon isn't exactly in Dead Space 3, once you beat the game on Classic Mode, you get the Devil Horns weapon, which is basically the same thing, except now you can headbang too. Pretty metal. And when it comes to the Hardcore Mode in Dead Space 3, this time around you can save as much as you like, but if you die, you have to start all over from the beginning. The reward for beating Hardcore Mode in this game is Retro Mode, which basically puts this ugly 8-bit filter over your entire game and lowers your frame rate. Totally worth it. Number 70. The Leaper Necromorph was originally designed a lot differently. Along with the slashers, the Leaper was one of the first Necromorph concepts created for the game very early into production. They were originally supposed to be much larger and composed of multiple bodies, but once the art team began to create and design the Ishimura, it became abundantly clear that the majority of the halls and spaces where Necromorphs could appear would be much more cramped and isolated than originally anticipated, and having such a big enemy leaping in those smaller areas simply wouldn't work. Based on the early concept art, the early Leapers looked a lot like large hulking masses of bodies and veins molded into a large animal, with frog-like appendages. And as they continued to downsize the Leaper, it became a full human body on all fours, but backwards and fleshy, before becoming various iterations of the upper half of a human torso, leading to the final design. Additionally, the Enhanced Leaper is the only Necromorph that kept the same exact design and model for all 3 games. Number 71. In addition to the last fact, when originally designing the Necromorphs, the initial idea was for them to look like bloated corpses that just washed up on a beach. However, when the bloated corpse idea didn't really bear fruit, the design of early Necromorphs transformed into something much more animal and insect-like. Examples being a spider-looking Necromorph, a beetle-looking Necromorph, and even one that looks like a giant fly. But once the shift was made to rearrange the human anatomy, the designs notably changed all across the board. Number 72. According to the art book released with the special edition of the first game, the Ishimura was just over 5,300 feet long, or 1.6 kilometers long, with a height of 1,550 feet, or 0.47 kilometers long. The width is unknown. Additionally, the Ishimura contained a crew of exactly 1,332 people. Number 73. In addition to the last fact, there's a bit of an inconsistency I noticed when it comes to Titan Station or the Sprawl. Apparently the Sprawl is roughly around 11 miles or 17 kilometers in length, which is about 11 Ishimuras stacked side by side. You can even see an example of the size comparison between the two in this concept art. I know this isn't including the height of the Sprawl, but somehow, this space station holds 1 million people, yet the Ishimura only holds roughly 1,300. Even if there is more living space on the Sprawl, from the size comparison alone, it doesn't seem like it's possible for it to hold so many people. But maybe that's just me reading into it too much. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Number 74. In Dead Space 2, there's an achievement called Clean Cut, where you have to successfully cut off all 3 of a lurker's tentacles in one shot with the line gun. However, this achievement can actually be achieved without using the line gun at all, even though it specifically states that the line gun is required in the description. Instead, this can also be done with things such as explosives, and appears to unlock this achievement as long as all 3 of the lurker's tentacles are blown off all at once, regardless of what method is used to remove them. Number 75. While it's hard to figure out the exact number, I've even tried counting myself, according to the developers there are over 50 different unique ways Isaac can die in the first game. Number 76. The Brethren Moons are essentially the ultimate goal of the markers in terms of Necromorph transformation. The Brethren Moons may have been officially revealed in Dead Space 3 as this ultimate goal, but their concept was developed shortly after the release of the first game, as Chuck Beaver and Ben Wanat sat down together and fine-tuned the lore of the series in preparation for Dead Space 2. With that, hints of their existence were teased back in Dead Space 2, and ultimately the goal of the Site-12 marker was to create one of these moons before Isaac destroyed it. With the remake of the first Dead Space coming out and the developers claiming they're going to add lore not present in the original game to better tie the story to Dead Space 2 and 3, it's likely that the existence of the Brethren Moons might make some sort of appearance, whether that be in dialogue or some other way. Additionally, the Brethren Moons were based on the Great Old Ones from H.P. Lovecraft's work. Number 77. A Wii port of Dead Space 2 was in production following the game's initial release in 2011, but ended up getting cancelled later that year. The official reason was so the team could focus on other projects, but it's rumored that this was actually because Extraction had failed previously on the Wii, and with Dead Space 2 already being considered a financial failure at that point, any further expenses from EA were simply not an option anymore. For this reason, Dead Space 3 was never even considered for the Wii U at the time of its development. But the development team did do various tests with other motion controls, and ended up going with voice-only commands for the Xbox 360 Kinect, as they felt any motion would disrupt the flow of the gameplay. Number 78. When it comes to Dead Space Downfall, according to the director, there was enough cut content that an entire sequel could have been made. While they didn't really elaborate as to what most of that cut content was, they did give one example, which was a scene involving Vincent fighting a Necromorph composed of all their fallen squad mates' corpses mixed together. This Necromorph would have been known as the Grave Robber, and you can see what it would have looked like via storyboards. Number 79. Out of everyone aboard the Ishimura before the outbreak, Gabe Weller was the only crew member confirmed to have survived. After the events of Severed, there are no longer any survivors from the initial outbreak aboard the Ishimura. Number 80. Dead Space Mobile has actually been featured in 2 movies, the first being The Darkest Hour, which came out in 2011, where it can be seen being played by one of the main characters towards the beginning of the film, and the second being Krampus, which came out in 2015, where it can be seen being played on an iPad by one of the main character's cousins. Since this movie takes place on Christmas of 2015, it's sad to think that just a few months later, Dead Space Mobile would be removed off of app stores everywhere. Number 81. There are numerous hidden features within the main menu of the first game, examples being multiple phrases written in Unitology script, such as the red marker is man-made, make us whole, and trust no one. Sometimes Nicole will briefly flash in the background. If you sit on the screen without pressing anything for a while, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star will be sung in a very ominous tone while showing various death animations for Isaac. And if you scroll through the main menu quickly, the music will change to a much higher and more intense RPM.
Have you ever felt like you were meant to be part of something bigger?
I hate this channel.
No! No!
Number 82. EA was adamant about Dead Space 2 hitting a 90 rating from Metacritic upon its release. Because of this, in Chapter 7 of the game, when entering the rocket booster, you can find a little Easter egg on the back of it which says MC90, which references the Metacritic score they were hoping to reach. Officially, Dead Space 2 has exactly a 90 rating from Metacritic, so this little reference paid off. Number 83. There's a popular glitch in the first game where after starting a new game, you can shoot this electrical socket on the wall, which for some reason spawns a necromorph that you can lead out into the main room. However, it ignores all of the other NPCs and will only go after Isaac. If you cut off its legs and force it to crawl, there's also a way you can make it back out into the main room before the doors lock. However, once you're out there and the doors do lock, you're essentially stuck in that area. Number 84. The CEC, or Concordance Extraction Corporation, are the largest solar mining and extraction company in the Earth colonies and the 5th largest company in terms of market value and profits. You might recognize their logo as the giant C clamping down on a planet, as they are responsible for creating the Planet Cracker ships. In the game, Battlefield Hardline, another EA property, the CEC is referenced as they were apparently awarded new mining rights in a landmark high court ruling, showing that in the events of that game, the CEC is just beginning. Additionally, in Battlefield Hardline, you can also find other Dead Space references, such as Isaac's helmet. Number 85. There's a bit of an inconsistency with Aegis 7's location, as at the beginning of the first Dead Space, it's mentioned to be millions of light years away, but at the same time, Tau Volantis was mentioned to be the furthest humanity has ever reached, and Tau Volantis is located somewhere at the greater edges of the Milky Way galaxy. Assuming that information is correct and Tau Volantis was discovered before Aegis 7, this would mean Aegis 7 is not even close to millions of light years away, and is instead also located within the Milky Way galaxy. Number 86. There were 3 unused models for children found within the code of Dead Space 2, meaning it's possible we were originally going to see some children fleeing the Necromorphs within the game. Number 87. The beginning of Dead Space 3 has a cheeky bit of foreshadowing for the end of the game. When you exit Isaac's apartment building, you can see that his apartment block is called Red Moon, which is obviously a reference to the end of the game's Blood Moon segment, and the existence of the Brethren Moons for that matter. Number 88. One of the most popular fan theories is that Isaac actually encounters various survivors aboard the Ishimura, but because of his dementia and the influence of the marker causing hallucinations, he hallucinates the survivors being necromorphs and promptly kills them. This theory developed because of Chapter 5 in the game, where you return to the medical deck that you previously visited in Chapter 2. This time around, there are various human corpses that weren't there when you passed by before, and to make matters worse, in some cases you also fought necromorphs in the exact spot some of these new bodies lay. This theory is additionally supported because the same thing happens in Chapter 6 of Dead Space 2, and other characters such as Gabe Weller, Sam Codwell, and Nolan Strauss have all had encounters where they hallucinated real people as necromorphs. Number 89. Titan Station has a method to routinely catch stray comets, which is how they harvest their water supply. This is apparently a regular process among space stations throughout the galaxy. Number 90. Dr. Terrence Kyne is voiced by Dario Argento in the Italian dub for the game. Dario is actually a director who would end up being dubbed the Master of Horror for his monumental work on horror movies back in the 1970s and 80s, being a director, screenwriter, and actor for many films from that time period. Number 91. The early design concept for the Exploder Necromorph was meant to be a pregnant woman. It was also noted to be loosely based on Kimiko from The Grudge, and would have walked across the floor dragging its bloated stomach in a similar manner before jumping up and exploding. Number 92. Similar to Isaac, Nolan Strauss is also named after writers, those writers being William F. Nolan and Charles Strauss. Number 93. In Dead Space Extraction, one of the main characters, Nathan McNeil, is forced to amputate his right hand. Considering the events of Extraction take place prior to Dead Space 1, it's a popular theory that the hand featured on the cover of Dead Space's game art is actually Nathan's amputated hand. That would make this one hell of an Easter egg, but it has yet to be confirmed by developers. Number 94. In the soundtrack for Dead Space 2, Isaac's leitmotif uses the note order DEAD, which obviously spells the word dead. Number 95. As a bit of a mistake on the developer's part in the first game, when in a vacuum, the lack of oxygen makes it so the flamethrower weapon won't work. Except, the problem is that the flamethrower should still be able to work in the vacuum, because its fuel, hydrazine, is hypergolic, meaning it should still ignite regardless when mixed with any sort of liquid oxidizer. This mistake was corrected in later games. Number 96. While you transverse across the Ishimura, you'll come across various informational posters along with advertisements to really make the vessel feel lived in. Some of those posters included movie posters. These movies included Shaolin vs. Space Ninja, Zero G Insanity, Kitty Kitty Bang Bang, and also a poster for a movie called Rancid Moon, which, if you'll remember, was the original working title for Dead Space, and what would later become the Callisto Protocol. The credits on the poster also list Glenn and the names of many other members of the development team as a little Easter egg. Number 97. In addition to the last fact, Dead Space 2 also has a fictional movie whose poster you can come across over various parts of the game. This movie is known as The Clogger, which was apparently an inside joke over at Visceral Games. The joke being that the toilets at their office had frequent problems. There's also a text log you can find in Chapter 10 that pokes even more fun at this. The sequel to The Clogger also makes an appearance in Dead Space 3. Number 98. In the first Dead Space, there was a hint about the ending all along. Since the game has been out for a while, a lot of people already know about this one. But spoiler alert, in Dead Space the main goal for Isaac is obviously to try and rescue or find out what happened to his girlfriend Nicole. And throughout the game we even run into her a few times as we transverse the Ishimura. But the truth of the matter is, Nicole was dead all along, and killed herself at the end of the message she sent you in the first place. We learn this at the end, but if you were paying attention to the first letter of each chapter of the game, it would actually spell out, Nicole is dead. Additionally, Nicole was named after Glenn's daughter. Number 99! In addition to the last fact, while Dead Space 2 didn't carry on this tradition, in Dead Space 3 the chapter's first letters spell out, Brother Moons are awake, in reference to the Brethren Moons being alive and the final reveal of the game. And in Dead Space 3 Awakened, it simply spells out, R.I.P. You can probably guess what that means. Additionally, Dead Space Extraction's chapter list spells out Warren Lies, referencing Warren lying about not being a Unitologist. And in Dead Space Mobile, they spell out He Will Betray, which is a reference to Tyler's disloyalty to Carrie. Number 100. Another small spoiler alert in case you skipped fact 98, but something you might not have realized from the first game is that you can actually visit the exact room that Nicole killed herself in during Chapter 2 via a power node override. It's a bit unsettling to note that the room is obviously locked from the outside, and on the inside, everything looks normal. There is no body, no sign of anything destroyed, and all the vents are intact. So with that in mind, what happened to Nicole's body? And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, number 101. For the final fact, when it comes to the Dead Space 1 game menu, you can sometimes see short distorted videos of what appears to be gore. The truth behind those distorted videos is actually a bit disturbing. In an interview with IGN back in 2009, Chuck Beaver explained that those flashing videos within the main menu are actually a real decomposing goat, as apparently the user interface team went out and bought a dead goat, and then spent an entire day with that goat's corpse, maggots, and a bunch of alcohol filming various videos with its internal organs. Genuinely the most disturbing bit of information I came across while making this video. And at first, I thought it was fake because I couldn't track down the source. But, unluckily, the video interview still exists on IGN's website. I'll never look at the main menu the same way again. But there you have it everybody, 101 facts about Dead Space. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and learned something new. If you did, make sure to drop a like. While you're at it, be sure to comment below what topic you'd like to learn 101 facts about next, and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss it. Like I said, Dead Space is one of my favorite games of all time, so I made sure to put a lot of time and effort into the research and editing of this one to give it the love it deserves. I really appreciate you guys checking this one out, it means a lot. Like I said earlier, you can follow me on Twitch at 2Spookster to hang out with me and catch me playing the Callisto Protocol and the new Dead Space remake. I'd love to meet more of you, and I hope to see you there. You can also follow me on Twitter at 2SpookyTube to keep up with the channel, and any other social media links can be found down below. I have a lot of massive projects coming soon, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon with a new video.
Oh!